One issue that's come up in the media is a new book by Rebecca Skloot about Henrietta Lacks, whose cervical cancer cells were used, it's been 30 or 40 years now, for a number of kinds of research, some of which was very, very important in terms of developing vaccines and so on. Her book is new, but she has written articles in the past, so some of it's been published before. And then simultaneously, there have been some media reports about some protracted litigation that was taking place in Texas involving the use of newborn screening blood samples for research. And Texas is one of about 4 states in the last 10 years in which there's been some kind of legal controversy over the use of newborn screening blood samples. Every child in this country since the mid-1960s has had a heel prick to draw a very small drop of blood, which is put on a certain kind of paper that enables the information in the blood to be stored and used at a later date. And the purpose of that initially was to screen newborns for certain types of metabolic and genetic conditions. And all the states do that. Most of the states, almost all of them, do that without obtaining informed consent from the parents to collect the blood sample, because that was the way the laws were written in those states. What's happened in the last 10 or 15 years has been various times and in various states controversy over the use of the samples once they're used for newborn screening purposes in other kinds of research. And in Texas, there was a lawsuit filed about 2 years ago in which a number of claims were raised that this was unconstitutional and illegal and for a variety of ways. But the long story, to make it short, is that the case was just settled without going to trial. And as a part of the settlement, the state of Texas is required to destroy, the media say, roughly 5 million stored blood spots. The bone of contention on the part of some parents was that they were not opposed, they said, to the research uses of these blood samples, but that they wanted to have been asked for permission to use them. And most of the parents that were interviewed in the media said, we probably would have said okay, but we really wanted to know. And so what this incident raises, as well as the discussion in Rebecca Skloot's book about what's called the HeLa cell line, is a long-standing practice dating back hundreds of years, in fact, to the collection of bodies for autopsies and so on, of using the human body and its various parts for different kinds of research and clinical purposes. And whether or not that's okay to do without asking the consent of living people for their body parts, or maybe the families of deceased people for use of deceased bodies for research. Discussions about consent and what constitutes research have been going on for a long time in this country and other countries. So while it may seem that the debates are new, because the federal regulations governing research with humans are relatively new in terms of late 20th century, mid 20th century, the conversations actually were going on for a long time. Under federal regulations governing research that's sponsored and funded by federal dollars, the regulatory standard is that when certain conditions are met and biological samples or data are coded in such a way or de-identified in such a way that the source cannot be identified under the current regulatory framework, those biological materials and data are not defined as human subjects. And that means if they don't fit into the regulatory definition of human subjects, then the requirement for informed consent and ethics review does not have to be met, which would have to be met under other conditions of research. So from a legal perspective, if you look at the regulations, researchers are correct when they say, but we don't have to get consent for stored, de-identified samples, or even IRB review, which is the ethics framework in this country, an institutional review board. Many people argue, well, the legal standard may not necessarily be the kind of ethical framework we want, and therein lies an enduring tension all the time in medical science, and an enduring tension in even in other categories of public policy for aid to other countries or public policies with regard to conflict situations, there's always this tension between what the Constitution may say, or the state statute may say, or the federal or state regulation allows, and what we as a society may say is our ethical framework. And there's an enduring tension all the time between what's legal and what's ethical. And I would argue that that tension is probably never going to go away. I would say, though, that what we need to do is to constantly have sustainable, ongoing conversations in which many people get to be at the table, not just the club of science or the club of public health officials or certain policy elites, but we need to open up that conversation. I'm Karen Maschke. I'm a research scholar at the Hastings Center with a background in political science and bioethics, and I'm also the editor of IRB, Ethics in Human Research, one of 2 journals published by the Hastings Center.